Welcome to On The Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and I'm here to wish you a happy new year in the year 2025. I'm also here to wish you a happy new old UFC gloves. No analysing the statistics of knockouts, putting the new gloves into analysis into the fights. You know, fighters that have a high knockdown rate or a high knockout rate, how are they going to serve in this particular fight? None of that anymore. We're back to the old gloves. This is great. The knockouts are going to be flowing throughout the year as well. And the last thing that I'm here to do is to break down UFC Vegas 101, which is the first UFC event of 2025. And it's the first UFC event for 4 or 5 weeks. I'm getting this podcast, I'm getting the breakdowns out really early this week. Well, it's not even this week, it's not even fight week. I'm getting them out early. I've done my research. There's no point in waiting. It's going to be out there. And tune in. But just before we do get into those breakdowns, as always, if you want to jump into the action next weekend for UFC Vegas 101, then you can do so at MMA Play 365. We've got something for every type of gambler. So if you're new here, we've got long-term gamblers with full written breakdowns. That's a section where some people might have their own opinions on fights and want to base what we are saying from the handicapper, which is myself, to either pass on a bet or maybe to confirm a bet. We've got a fun gamblers section which is full of parlay options. You can either create your own parlay or we've got pre-built parlays for you there. And also we've got an official bet section in that handicapper section as well, which is exactly where my money is going if that's what interests you. And of course, with all our subscriptions, you get Baze AI, our UFC prediction software, which gives you a percentage prediction for every possible outcome of every fight on every UFC card every single week. All subscriptions are super affordable as well, as our ethos here at MMA Play 365 is to make sure that you can earn your money back that you pay for our service as quick as you possibly can so you can start profiting on the bets that you make. And that's all at MMAplay365.com. And with the introduction out the way, with the promotion out of the way, let's get breaking some fights down for the first time in 2025. And we start, as always, in the main event. It's a rematch. We've got Mackenzie Dern versus Amanda Ribas 2. Now, this might be a bit of a rough end to the first card of 2025, but I kind of like these grappling fights, and I'm hoping we do see a similar fight to what we saw last time. I think it would be unfair to say that we're going to see exactly what we saw last time, because especially with Mackenzie Dern, like, she's developed like... Look, she's a million miles ahead of where she was when these two ladies last fought, which was 2019, which we're looking at around 6 years ago now. And to be fair to Amanda Ribas, you know, she's developed as well. But I definitely think out the two, Mackenzie Dern is the one that has shown greater improvements and a greater development of her MMA game out of the two. But still, this is an Amanda Ribas that is, at the, you know, floating around at the top of the division. She's a world-class fighter in the division, and I think Mackenzie Dern is now a world-class fighter in this division as well. You know, you can't say that she's not world-class with the attributes that she has with her jiu-jitsu, and of course the jiu-jitsu is still, you know, she's got the same credentials now than what she had 6 years ago when she last fought Ribas. It's just where the developments have come with Dern is it's not only a striking, which a striking now allows her to be able to wrestle a little bit better than what she used to be able to. And I still think the wrestling needs, you know, a level of improvement as well to really make her that bit more dangerous in MMA. But with the jiu-jitsu, I think she's just become more comfortable inside the cage with the jiu-jitsu. So I'm not saying that her jiu-jitsu is better now than what it was, you know, 6 years ago. She's still the same absolute beast with the jiu-jitsu now as what she was 6 years ago. It's just, like I say, I feel like she's bridged a gap in MMA and she's just able to use that jiu-jitsu more suited inside the cage than what she did 6 years ago is what I'm saying. But what was impressive with Amanda Ribas the last time they fought is Amanda Ribas took her down a number of times. She was able to stay on top and stay safe. Amanda Ribas has also got a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Now, in a straight up jiu-jitsu bout between these two, I think Mackenzie Dern would absolutely roll her. But with, you know, MMA, punches involved, elbows involved, Amanda Ribas gives herself that extra bit of a chance to be able to deal with what Dern is trying to deliver from bottom if it's Ribas on top. So I think, again, I think there they were well matched last time out, but Ribas showed that she was a level above. I think this is going to be more competitive than it was last time. Ribas ran away with it last time, and I just don't think that it's going to be that type of fight this time out. I think that Mackenzie Dern's striking's a lot better, so she's going to be a bit more competitive from her side when it's on the feet. I think if Ribas does take Dern down, which I'm still on the fence of if she's going to, even though she had success last time out, I think if Ribas does take Dern down, I think Dern's going to be... Again, she's going to be more dangerous off her back than what she was in the first fight as well. And you've just got to look back since that last fight as well. I know I keep referencing it, but it is quite an important factor. Since Mackenzie Dern lost that last fight to Ribas, she's 7-4 in the UFC with her only losses. Well, I say only losses. She's lost 4 fights, but the losses have come to Marina Rodriguez, who's at the top of the division, Yan Xiaonan, who's fought for a title at the top of the division, Jessica Andrade being... an absolute monster at the top of a number of different divisions in the UFC over the years. Amanda Lemos, who is probably the least out of the names that I've just mentioned, but she's still a power puncher. She's still super dangerous. Mackenzie Dern still had moments against her as well. So the fighters that she's losing against, to be fair, are around the level of Amanda Ribas, but it's showing that Mackenzie Dern is only losing against the fighters at the top of the division, which again backs up the development. Now, like I say, I think the fight is going to be much closer than it was last time out. I think it's going to be much closer than the betting line suggests. Mackenzie Dern's around a plus 150 underdog. And I think over 5 rounds, it gets even closer as well. I just think it's one of these fights that we're going to see a bit of everything. We're going to see a bit of striking. We're going to see some wrestling. We're going to see grappling moments. I think we're going to see a true mixed martial arts fight between 2 fighters that are very closely matched. Again, in my opinion, the striking advantage, I still think is sided with Amanda Ribas. The grappling, I genuinely think that Dern isn't just going to, lay on her back for 3 rounds here and have what happened last time out happen to her again here. I think she's going to be more active. She's going to be more dangerous. And the later the fight goes, I think Ribas might just put a little bit of a pause onto the takedowns. So all in all, I think it's a close competitive fight. I think it's going to be one of those fights that could potentially go to a decision. And if it does, we'll be sitting there thinking, well, Mackenzie Dern's got 2 rounds there and Ribas has got 2 rounds there. And then there's a round that's a 50-50 round, but maybe one of the rounds we're scoring to Ribas was close. Maybe one of the rounds we're scoring to Dern was close. And all in all, it's just going to be a little bit of a, right, okay, well, either fighter could win this fight. In those types of fights, I always tend to side with the underdog. So for those reasons, I'm picking Mackenzie Dern to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got a fun fight here between Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Carlston Harris. And I like the matchmaking as well. Look, Ponzinibbio is a fighter that has been an absolute legend in the UFC, has been in some great fights. He's fought in the UFC for a long time. He's put on a performance for us all for years and years. And he is looking like he's slowly starting to come to the end of his fighting career, but I don't think he's there yet. I still think he's got a number of years in him. It's just, like I say, he's just a little bit slower, a little bit less reactive. He can be got at a little bit more than what he could sort of like 5 or 6 years ago is what I'm trying to say. Carlston Harris on the other side, look, this guy's up there in age as well, and although he hasn't been in the UFC for as long as Ponzinibbio, he's a fighter that, again, has got some vulnerabilities, specifically within the striking, getting hit. Last time out was a bad knockout lost for him. But Harris does have some tools that still makes him really dangerous. It's just he needs certain types of fights to be able to use those tools effectively. Now, going back to the matchmaking, I love this type of matchmaking because it's not as if Ponzinibbio or Harris has been matched up with, a young 25-year-old killer that's knocking everybody out and, the Ponzinibbio or the Harris is being used as, a sort of gatekeeper type of role where hopefully the UFC are looking to propel the young talent up into the rankings. Like, this is a really well-matched fight because, like I say, both towards the end of the career, both are showing slight vulnerabilities that they might not have shown, a number of years ago. And I like these types of fights. Now, for Carlston Harris, I alluded to this just a couple of minutes ago in regards to the tools that he needs to win the fight. Now, Harris has got a really dangerous submission game. That front choke submission, the front choke submissions like the Anacondas, the Darce, potential ninja chokes are there, and guillotines. Like, these types of submissions are the submissions that Harris can really get at people. And Harris is one of these fighters that can be losing can be losing an entire fight until an opponent shoots on him, leaves the neck in there, and then suddenly Harris wraps it up and the fight's a wrap as well. But it's whether he can get to those positions against Ponzinibbio, and I'm just not sure he can. Like, Ponzinibbio's not the type of fighter. Look, he will shoot takedowns and can shoot takedowns in fights, but he doesn't need to. The predominant style of Ponzinibbio is to stay on the feet and strike. So I see no reason for Ponzinibbio to be shooting takedowns against Harris. And if he does shoot a takedown against Harris and Harris wraps that neck up, then that's on Ponzinibbio, because I don't believe he needs to do that. Ponzinibbio will need his wrestling, I believe, in this fight. It should be from a defensive perspective only. But when it comes to the striking, I think Ponzinibbio is the way better technical striker. I still think he's going to be a little bit faster than Harris. He's definitely going to hit harder than Harris. And look, with Carlston Harris, he's got a very unorthodox striking game. Now, it's not clean, it's not pretty, it's not technical. However, it is efficient. He can crack. We've seen him knock people out, like the Impa Kasanganay fight. He put it on Impa. So with Carlston Harris, although he can be efficient striking, it's not clean and technical. The thing is, with Ponzinibbio, I'm just not sure Ponzinibbio is going to fall into a trap where he's going to let a lot of unorthodox, untechnical strikes land on him too often. And in fact, I think it's going to be the opposite way around. I think Ponzinibbio is going to be the one landing hard on Carlston Harris. And I kind of feel that Ponzinibbio could knock Harris out in this fight. And if he doesn't, a 30-27 3-round striking clinic from Ponzinibbio, I think, is on the table as well. Ponzinibbio's just got to keep the fight vertical. Don't shoot a takedown. And if you do, don't shoot a sloppy takedown. And also just be aware that once you start piecing Harris up, which I believe will happen, just be wary that the takedown's going to come back at you, and defend the takedown. Make sure Harris doesn't get on top and spend too long on you. But again, Ponzinibbio's not a new fighter. He's not a fresh fighter that's entering his career. He's been around the block. He trains at American Top Team. He's got great coaches, great partners, especially from a wrestling perspective and a grappling perspective. He's going to know how to defend takedowns. He's going to know how to stand back up to his feet. And it's not as if Carlston Harris is like this BJJ phenom that's going to absolutely keep him down if there is a takedown. So all in all, I like Ponzinibbio. I'm picking Santiago Ponzinibbio to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got an interesting fight here between Abdul Razak Alhassan versus Cesar Almeida. Now, Alhassan has had a pretty rough time of it lately. He had a couple of cancelled fights in 2023, had a cancelled fight in 2024, a winnable fight against Josh Fremd, in my opinion, as well, the 2024 one. And then the last fight that he actually had was a no contest against Cody Brundage. Now, Alhassan dropped Brundage, hurt him. He was ground and pound finishing, but there was some strikes that landed to the back of the head. It was deemed a no contest when, Alhassan should have won the fight. The fight before that, Joe Pyfer, that was a loss. Again, there's no shame in that. Claudio Ribeiro, he got a win before that, and then he's took a loss against Buckley in the fight before that as well. And look what Buckley's doing now. So all in all, Alhassan is one of these fighters that we absolutely know his ceiling, we know his strengths, we know his weaknesses, and he's very aggressive, he's still very entertaining. He'll lose fights against fighters at the top of the division, but on the flip side of that, he's very, very live in fights outside of that. Now, in comes Cesar Almeida. Cesar Almeida is a fighter that's come from the kickboxing scene, dangerous striker. We've seen that. He's training, or at least he was training out in Extreme Couture. I'm not sure if he is still there or not. I'd imagine he still is. So he's been learning the ropes from a wrestling perspective, and his defensive wrestling's actually picked up quite well over the last few fights. He's able to defend takedowns. If he is taken down, he can get back up to his feet, but there is still some vulnerabilities there. However, I don't think it's that much of a talking point in this fight, just because I just don't see Alhassan wrestling, although we have seen the odd surprise fight from Alhassan where he decides to shoot takedowns. Again, it was the Buckley fight. There was a lot of takedowns in that fight for two fighters that were known as aggressive, explosive power strikers. So who knows what we're going to get, but style versus style, we've got striker versus striker. Now, the thing is with Cesar Almeida, he's levels above Alhassan in regards to the technical striking, in my opinion. You can see that he's a lot cleaner, he's a lot crisper. He picks and chooses his shot selections and his combinations, and when he decides to come into range just a little bit better. And like I say, that's the kickboxing background and that's the technical striking advantage that Cesar Almeida has. However, Cesar Almeida can be got at. We saw that last time out against Roman Kopylov. Kopylov dropped him hard. And when I was watching that fight back, I was just thinking, look, if Kopylov can land that sort of shot with the old UFC gloves, the new UFC gloves, which are now the old UFC gloves, if Kopylov is dropping Cesar Almeida like that, then absolutely Alhassan can drop that. Alhassan is one of the hardest hitters in the division. So I'm thinking, look, Cesar Almeida is a good technical fighter. He's definitely a fighter that, look, at the end of this fight, if it's a 30-27 or if he absolutely pieces Alhassan up from a technical perspective and stays out the way of the power shots, I can absolutely see that happening. Like, Almeida is a favourite for a reason, but Alhassan is just aggressive, is explosive, and again, Almeida's not immune to be able to be getting dropped or knocked out. We've seen it, and in a striking fight, Alhassan's going to have opportunities, plenty of opportunities to land on Almeida and hurt him. And it might only take a couple of hard shots, or maybe he drops him and Almeida, does take a little bit of a step back if he's not knocked out. And maybe he's a little bit hesitant. I just think that what I'm trying to get at here is when you look at the betting lines, you've got Cesar Almeida that's almost a 3-1 favourite. He is a 3-1 favourite in some spots, with Alhassan roughly around plus 250 as the underdog. That's a wide line for this type of fight, and it might be one of those fights where, we're calling it quite close and, giving Alhassan plenty of chances to be live in this fight, and he might get that knockout. And we've seen Almeida dropped and hurt before, and Alhassan hits harder than anyone that Cesar Almeida's fought before. And it might be one of those fights where actually Almeida does end up looking like a 3-1 favourite because he was levels above from a technical perspective, and Alhassan never had the opportunities or never gave himself enough opportunities to knock him out. It could be one of those, but pre-fight, we don't know that. Pre-fight, to me, we've got striker versus striker. We've got a good technical striker in Almeida versus an absolute powerhouse in Alhassan. The technical striker we've seen has got vulnerabilities in regards to defensive work within the striking, being dropped in his previous fight, and now he's got Alhassan, who's a bigger hitter. To me, it's just a much closer fight than the betting line suggests. And as I said with the Mackenzie Dern and Ribas fight, in these types of scenarios, more often than not, I will side with the underdog. So for those reasons, I'm picking Abdul Razak Alhassan to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've only just spoke about him. We've got Roman Kopylov versus Chris Curtis. And again, this to me is a striker versus striker fight. I really don't see Kopylov shooting takedowns, and I really don't see Chris Curtis shooting takedowns. And from a striking perspective, they've both got very different striking styles. Kopylov is more of a kickboxer, uses his kicks way more than what Curtis does. Curtis is very boxing heavy. So we've got, again, from an MMA perspective, a boxer versus a kickboxer. And it's a really interesting fight. Now, from Chris Curtis's perspective, he's been in there with the better level of competition. He's, been in there with much higher rated competition. He's been in there in main events. And I just feel that with Chris Curtis, from an experience perspective, it allows him to be live in fights. And he's an underdog as well, which, again, is very interesting. But on the flip side to that is Curtis can have moments where he's sort of coasting a little bit in regards to just waiting for his moments, making reads, and there can be some actionless moments in his fights. So it's not as if Curtis has always got his foot on the accelerator, moving forwards, putting a ton of volume on his opponents. And for me, I think that suits Kopylov and the style that Kopylov has, because Kopylov likes to be able to, take his time a little bit, get his reads in, and because he's the kicker out of the two, he can fight better at different ranges, at longer ranges. So Kopylov can be on the outside, kicking and striking in, whereas Curtis, from a boxing perspective, needs to be in boxing range, so he has to close the distance. Now, if Curtis isn't putting a ton of pressure on Kopylov, and if he's not putting a high pace on Kopylov and throwing a lot of volume at Kopylov, specifically in boxing range, then for me, that's going to give Kopylov opportunities to really put on a bit of a clinic here. And Kopylov is a very good technical striker. So if he starts to be able to feel comfortable in numerous ranges in this fight, which is what I expect, then Curtis could find himself in a situation where he's just slowly the fight's just slowly getting away from him, and Curtis is going to have his moments in this fight. Like I say, he's an experienced fighter. He's fought at, high-level competition in the division. But I just think that he's got to do more and put the pressure on Kopylov to be able to really take this fight from Kopylov. And that's just not Chris Curtis's style. So I think even though with what I've said in previous fights in this podcast already, that in close and competitive fights, I will more often than not side with the underdog. That's why I use the phrase and expression more often than not, because there are situations where I won't side with the underdog in that specific fight. And that's because I just think that the style of Curtis plays right into the style of Kopylov. And for those reasons, I'm picking Roman Kopylov to win this fight. And in the next fight, this to me is probably the most intriguing fight on the entire card. I've got a funny feeling it's going to be the most spoken about on the entire card. It's going to have the most split between the fans and other MMA bettors on the entire card as well. We've got the newcomer Austin Bashi versus C-Rod Christian Rodriguez. Now, Austin Bashi, let's start with this guy. This guy looks like a stud. He's 13-0. He was an all-state wrestler in high school. He's a legitimate BJJ black belt. He's got what looks like good cardio, good pressure, takedowns for days. And then, like I say, he's a BJJ in black belt, so he absolutely can be dominant in a top position as well. He's a fighter that doesn't give his opponents any space, that closes the distance. Like I say, he's explosive in what he does. His striking looks decent as well. I think that's probably the area that he will need to develop, if he does start to get close to the top 15. But the kid, like I say, the right adjective to use for him is he just looks like an absolute stud. Now, what's interesting is the Christian Rodriguez side, because this is the fourth time that the UFC are giving this type of opponent to Christian Rodriguez. Now, they gave him Raul Rosas Jr. back in 2023, so a couple of years ago now. So they gave him Raul Rosas Jr. at 7-0. Raul Rosas Jr. was this young 17, 18-year-old stud, again, like I've just said about Bashi, that has got pace, that has got pressure, that has got wrestling, that has got good topside jiu-jitsu, that doesn't give his opponents any time to breathe. And the UFC gave Raul Rosas Jr. to Christian Rodriguez. Now, Raul Rosas Jr. started the fight well, but Christian Rodriguez, he's a very well-rounded fighter himself. He's got good striking, but his wrestling and his grappling, especially defensively, is very tricky to deal with. He's a hard fighter to take down, and is an even more difficult fighter to keep down. But whilst these types of cardio freak fighters are fresh, they can get at him. The issue is, with the way that Christian Rodriguez defends and scrambles and gets back up to his feet, he makes it very tough on the cardio and on the gas tank. Raul Rosas Jr. at 7-0, gassed out. His first loss was to Christian Rodriguez. In comes Cameron Simon in the next fight. Cameron Simon's a 9-0 prospect, a little bit different from these pressure wrestlers, but he's a 9-0 prospect, very good striker, very aggressive. He's actually a very, very good striker, but he's also got good wrestling and good grappling himself. 9-0, stud. They give him to Christian Rodriguez. Christian Rodriguez beats him. Cameron Simon takes his first loss. Then in comes Isaac Dulgarian. Now, for me, this one, it's a bit hit and miss, because for me, it's the most impressive win. But it's also a fight that I still don't think I still don't think that Christian Rodriguez won that fight against Isaac Dulgarian. But it was, I suppose, close enough where it's not a robbery, and you probably could say it could go either way. Although I kind of bite in my tongue when I say that, because I think Isaac Dulgarian won the fight. But however, Isaac Dulgarian, 6-0, hyper prospect, a ton of first round finishers. This kid had wrestling credentials, or has wrestling credentials, way higher than Cameron Simon, way higher than Raul Rosas Jr., and even better than Austin Bashi as well. And Isaac Dulgarian, he could have had him out. He could have had Rodriguez out of there in round one. It was a 10-8 round, I believe. But then what happened is the pressure wrestling, but the way that Christian Rodriguez defends, takedowns, scrambles, and gets back up to his feet, started hitting the gas tank of Dulgarian, who we thought would have this really good gas tank because he was one of these, high-level wrestlers that have come into the UFC. Isaac Dulgarian slowed down, Rodriguez took over, and Rodriguez ended up winning a split decision. Isaac Dulgarian takes his first loss as a professional MMA fighter to Christian Rodriguez. This is now 3 times it happened. Now, the funny part is to this, well, not funny if you could, Christian Rodriguez, is Christian Rodriguez that then gets put against Julian Erosa. It's almost like the UFC have said, look, fair play to you, kid. You've won 3 on the bounce against 3 studs that were all unbeaten. All their first losses were to you. Here's Julian Erosa. Be a tricky fight, but one that, will get you to a 4-fight winning streak. And Erosa subs Christian Rodriguez in round 1. And look, that's just how MMA goes sometimes. And to be fair to Julian Erosa, I don't mean any disrespect with what I've just said. Julian Erosa is actually a really tricky fighter to deal with. And the amount of fights that Erosa's actually been in where he's an absolute massive underdog, has no chance of winning this fight, and then he wins convincingly is crazy. Like, he does that quite a lot. So I'm not putting too much stock into that last fight. The ones that interest me are the Raul Rosas Jr., Cameron Simon and Isaac Dulgarian, because all those were unbeaten studs that their first loss was Christian Rodriguez. And here we've got Austin Bashi, who's an unbeaten stud against Christian Rodriguez. So it's like, are we going to see the same thing that's, lightning strike? Does lightning strike 4 times? We'll have to wait and see. But look, from what I'm seeing in this fight is, I think Austin Bashi is big, he's physical, he's very aggressive, his wrestling and grappling you can clearly see is at a very high level. So the question for me is, does Austin Bashi gas out early on? Or well, not early on, but does he gas out sort of mid-fight because of the work that he's putting in early on Christian Rodriguez? Now, I've seen Austin Bashi, the last fight that Austin Bashi had in the Contender Series, you saw takedown after takedown after takedown. You saw his opponent getting taken down, getting back up. Austin Bashi's working, he's closing the distance, he's just on him like glue. I didn't see Bashi start to slow down too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give Austin Bashi the benefit of the doubt here in regards to, if Rodriguez is going to be super competitive defensively, wrestling and grappling, which I absolutely think is going to be, I do think that Bashi has got good cardio and a heavy gas tank to be able to not gas out early enough for Rodriguez to take over the fight. So what I mean by that is, I'm going to give Austin Bashi the benefit of the doubt that he can pressure wrestle hard and pressure wrestle and grapple hard and keep being relentless with it, going back to the well with it for 2 rounds. And win 2 rounds. He might gas out the 3rd round, but he also might not. Like I say, his cardio from what I've seen looks like he's got a good gas tank. So I'm not expecting him to gas out in round 3. But what I'm saying is I think he's got 10 minutes of it, which should be enough to win this fight. So I am saying that lightning's not going to strike 4 times. Although if it does strike 4 times, I'm kind of not going to be surprised either. But I do think Bashi is the goods because of the gas tank. For those reasons, I'm picking Austin Bashi to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Punahele Soriano versus Uros Medic. Now, this is another interesting fight. I kind of feel like Medic is overpriced on the betting line as well. He's sitting at around minus 200 as a favourite. And I kind of feel that that's too wide because of a chance that the fight can go a certain way. And what I mean by that is, look, Punahele Soriano came to the UFC with a little bit of hype around him. He was this power striker that was super durable and had this wrestling background, and he seemed to have it all. But what then happened was he kind of fell in love with his striking a little bit, and then when the knockouts weren't really happening for him, he was resorting to his wrestling. But then we found out that, if he's wrestling heavily, his cardio can take a little bit of a hit as well. So now we're thinking, Puna Soriano's now losing fights and he kind of isn't getting his knockouts going and he's not really getting his wrestling going. And it was one of them where, he was clearly going through a struggling time and we didn't know how he would come out of it the other end. But last time out, to be fair to him, he fought Miguel Baeza. He scored 5 takedowns, won comfortably, and maybe the wrestling and the cardio is being worked on. And if that's the case, then that's why I think the minus 200 line is too wide, because I think Puna Soriano is going to be super live in this fight if he can get his wrestling going. Because, look, from a striking perspective, Soriano can still crack, but I think Medic is a little bit cleaner and more crisp, and I think the deceptive power for Medic will be there as well. So if Soriano has, in his game plan, a 3-round kickboxing fight with Medic, I think Medic can really hurt Soriano. Front kicks to the body, drain the gas tank a little bit and put it on him. But if Soriano starts mixing up takedowns, this is where Medic can be got at. Like, it's not easy to take Medic down, but you can take him down. And Soriano definitely has the tools in his arsenal to be able to take Uros Medic down and sort of like try to nullify the fight a little bit and break any flow up that Medic is gaining momentum on his feet, that type of performance. So it's tough to predict this fight confidently because we're still in a moment of not knowing what Soriano's going to do. Like if Soriano was on a 3-fight winning streak and he took his opponents down 5 times one fight, 4 times the next fight, 5 times the next fight, then we're thinking, right, okay, we know what Soriano's going to do. But that was just the first fight back of getting back to his wrestling, managing the gas tank and looking good. So we just don't know yet what this fight's going to look like for Soriano, and that's why it makes it difficult to predict. So from a striking perspective is what I'm kind of basing this on. I think Medic can get at Soriano. So like I say, there's every chance Soriano comes in here with the same game plan as he did last time out. And if we see that again, then the next time I break a Punahele Soriano fight down, it'll be a little bit differently. There'll be more trust put in him from knowing or being confident of what he's going to try and do in the cage. But for this fight, I'm just not confident in knowing what he's going to try and do. So that's why I'm basing it on what I do know and that Medic is a dangerous striker. I'm picking Uros Medic to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Jose Johnson versus Felipe Bunes. Now, Johnson must be the tallest guy at flyweight. Like, he was a tall bantamweight, but at flyweight is like 6 foot tall, which is just huge for flyweight. I just don't know how anybody at 6 foot makes 125 pounds. And then he's got 71.5-inch reach as well, which actually is a long reach for flyweight, but it's not long when you compare it to how tall he is with his frame. So bit of a mixture there. But yeah, he's going to have a huge height advantage over Felipe Bunes in this fight. But at first, look, when I started researching, watching tape on this fight, I instantly took to Felipe Bunes. Sorry, that was before. So when I saw both fighters, I instantly took to Felipe Bunes because I know he's a good grappler. I know he's got takedowns in him as well. Like, look, he had a tough fight against Josh Van. But he got a couple of takedowns against Josh Van. There were trips as well. So, again, that's going to help him more against somebody with the length of Johnson. It's going to be hard for Bunes to get not under the hips because he's going to be more or less level to the hips when he's dropping his levels and shooting the takedown. But it's going to be difficult to lift both of Johnson's legs up off the mat and dump him with a single or a double. Well, that's a double, but he's going to be difficult to get a single as well, just offsetting that balance. But with the trips are a little bit different. If he's got good trips, then he should be able to get Johnson down. And then I was thinking, well, look, Johnson is, for as good as what he is, I actually really like Jose Johnson, by the way. I think he's an exciting fighter. He's definitely got deceptive power. He's got some flair about him. I like him. But the massive weakness in Johnson's game at this level in the UFC is he struggles to defend takedowns. The good news for Johnson is he's got a really tricky grappling game. So, he can lock in a triangle or an armbar, use those long legs to his advantage. He can also get back up to his feet as well. But he just gets taken down time and time again. And eventually the get-ups stop a little bit, and then the submission attempts stop a little bit, and then the ground control time starts racking up for his opponent. And it's just an area where he needs to work on. But when I was looking at the tape, I actually I think Johnson's going to get taken down. Like, I'm not saying he's not, but I just think that Johnson might be able to reverse positions here. I think he might be able to just be very difficult from a scrambling perspective, where Bunes probably wants to sit and rest, but I think there's going to be spaces for Johnson to escape certain positions and be able to either get back up to his feet or get on top of Bunes. And Johnson's actually a bit of a nightmare once he's on top, because normally when he escapes positions and reverses a position from his back, he's very close to the back of his opponents. And then once he sinks his hooks in, the long legs just prove really difficult. And then on the feet, I think that Felipe Bunes is okay, but I think Johnson's a way better striker. So I'm kind of seeing one of these fights where Johnson's a way better striker. Bunes is going to have his moments with the takedowns, but I think Johnson is going to be able to at least remain safe, but then, like I say, look for spaces and gaps to be able to escape into or explode into to reverse positions and get on top of Bunes. And Johnson has these types of fights where the better grappler, or at least the better BJJ player, shall I say, will have difficulty with Johnson and then everyone's so surprised, oh, Johnson's spent loads of time on top. Well, he's had too many of those fights for me to be surprised anymore. So, like I say, I was really, really on the Bunes side as the underdog. Whether you want to play Johnson at like a minus 200 favourite, I don't know, that's probably not for me. If he comes down to maybe like the minus 150 range, that might be where I start to look a little bit more interested, but I'd be shocked for him to get down to that minus 150 range. I think he's probably going to settle around minus 200, but I could be wrong, been wrong before. However, from a straight pick prediction perspective, I'm picking Jose Johnson to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the newcomer Marco Tulio versus Ihor Potieria. Now, with all respect to Ihor Potieria here, and I'm not saying anything negative actually, that sounded like I was about to come into something negative, but with respect to Ihor Potieria, like the dude is still in the UFC. Yes, he's 2-5 in the UFC, but man, he puts on exciting fights and he's entertaining and he comes forward. He'll eat a punch if it means try to land a punch himself. And like, he's an entertaining fighter, and for that, you've got to have respect for him. Now, the issue is he's 2-5 in the UFC. The only wins he's got in the UFC are the Mauricio Shogun Hua win, which Hua was absolutely at the end of his career. And then you've also got Robert Brychek, who made his UFC debut, looked great outside of the UFC, came into the UFC. I thought he was going to be great in the UFC, but, you know, he fell short to Potieria on that night. So the two wins that Potieria's got in the UFC aren't the best wins to be shouting about. Now, the losses that he's had in the UFC, I kind of feel like he's lost to not every fighter, because there are some good, it's hard saying this, but there's some good losses in there. You know, the Cesar Almeida I don't think is a bad loss, and then there's Michel Pereira that I don't think is a bad loss either. But he's also lost to maybe one or two fighters that I think Marco Tulio is better than. So this is why I'm kind of... Look, when I saw Marco Tulio at minus 400, I expected something that I didn't see in tape. But with that being said, Marco Tulio fights out of Shooter Box Diego Lima, you know, the same gym as Charles Do Bronx Oliveira, under obviously Diego Lima, and you can see that he's got aggressive striking, he's explosive, he comes forward. We haven't seen too much of the grappling, but you've got to assume it's there with where he trains. And I don't think the grappling's going to play too much of a factor in this fight. I think it's going to be a striking fight. But the way Potieria fights, with him being, you know, quite aggressive himself, wants to put on a show, will eat a punch to take a punch, I think that's a horrible style to come into against someone like Marco Tulio, because if Tulio's exploding into these moments where Potieria's coming forward, it's going to be a car crash, and I think Potieria's hittable in that car crash. I think Tulio will be able to land on him, and I think it could be a really dangerous approach from Potieria. Now, if he takes a different approach, he's more reserved, you know, tries to, you know, pick and choose when he strikes. That's A, not his game, and B, it's just not the way he thrives in fights. So I think even in that type of fight, it's going to allow Tulio to come onto him and Tulio to explode again, as and when he wants. So I kind of think it's a bad stylistic fight for Potieria, even though he's super entertaining and he'll put up a fight for as long as it lasts. But I think Tulio gets at him at some point in this fight. For those reasons, I'm picking Marco Tulio to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Thiago Moises versus Trey Ogden. Now, Trey Ogden, again, is a fighter that I have to pay respect to, because, you know, he's very serviceable and he knows what he wants to do in fights. He knows where he's strong and he fights to his strengths, and you've got to respect that. He's very serviceable, like I've already said, but I kind of feel he's serviceable more efficiently within a certain quality of opponent within the UFC. Like, he's absolutely a UFC caliber fighter, but just at a certain level, he's very serviceable. And I kind of feel like Moises is, I wouldn't say levels and levels above, because he's not, but I do think he is a level above where Ogden's going to have difficulties. And then when you start looking at style versus style, like where Ogden thrives is he thrives in being able to take his opponents down, suffocating them, and he's very, very good topside. But you look at the guys that Ogden's doing this to, and they're not jiu-jitsu players, or at least not predominantly jiu-jitsu players. The one fighter that he did fight that was predominantly a jiu-jitsu player was Jordan Levitt. And actually, you know, to be fair to Ogden, I think the first time that Levitt was on top of him, he slipped. But the fact of the matter is, Ogden was on his back a couple of times against Levitt and didn't really have an answer off his back. And then when he was shooting at Levitt, because Levitt was a BJJ player, he was able to answer what Ogden was trying to be offensive with. So when you look at someone like Thiago Moises, look, Moises definitely isn't Jordan Levitt. Like, he's levels above that. But I think that he's a level above where Ogden's really good at. Like, Moises is predominantly a BJJ player. He's a solid black belt. He's still improving. He's at American top team, so he's going to have so much preparation in regards to other black belts in the gym, other fighters trying to take him down and keep him down. And I just think it's going to be very difficult for Ogden to activate the game plan where he's going to be strongest. And then when you go to the striking, look, Ogden's a decent striker as well. But again, it's an area where, you know, he can be okay, but he can also be got at as well. Same as Thiago Moises. Thiago Moises is a fighter that, from a striking perspective, he can absolutely put it on his opponents. But we've also seen opponents put it on him. Now, where there's a big difference for me here, because what I've just described this fight as two fighters that can be good striking but can be got at. Two fighters that are good at jiu-jitsu, even though I think Moises is a level above. So that is an advantage for Moises. So it is sounding like I think it's a relatively close fight right now, to the point where Ogden could win. But where it completely changes things is, and this matters, like, this is not a style versus style piece of analysis, technical analysis or anything like that. But when you look at the fighters that beats Thiago Moises, for me, I talk about this quite a lot, more than what I actually realised when I started to look into this fight. I actually thought, well, damn, like, I look at this quite a lot, to be fair. And I feel like I'm right more times than I'm wrong with this. But when you look at the fighters that Moises is losing against, you've got Beneil Dariush, Damir Ismagulov, Islam Makhachev, Joel Alvarez, Benoit Saint-Denis, Ludovic Klein, which you can say what you want about Ludovic Klein. Like, this dude's looking like an absolute killer right now. Like, the fighters that Moises is losing against are really high-level fighters. And all of those fighters are better than Trey Ogden. So, for me, Moises is losing against a certain level of opponent that isn't Ogden. Ogden's lower than that level of opponent. Ogden's beating a certain level of opponent, which Moises is better than that level of opponent. So for me, all signs are pointing to Moises. I do think that Ogden will have moments in this fight. Like, I don't think it's going to be an absolute whitewash, but I just don't see Ogden winning this fight. Like, Moises is strong, extremely strong, where Ogden is strong himself, and Moises is better in that department. And Moises just fought the better level of competition, and he only really loses against a certain level of opponent, which isn't Ogden. So with all that taken into consideration, I'm picking Thiago Moises to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got newcomer Andreas Gustafsson versus Preston Parsons. First things first, do not ask Andreas Gustafsson if he's brothers with Alexander Gustafsson, because it seems to really piss him off. But onto this fight and the fighter himself. Look, with Andreas Gustafsson, I'm super excited for him in the UFC. Like, I've seen him live before as well. The Damian Janikowski fight is actually really difficult to find online. I haven't found it. I don't know where it is. KSW seem to, well, they don't seem to. They have their own pay-per-view system, so they'll have that fight in a library somewhere. I just don't think it's public. But I was actually there live for that fight with Damian Janikowski, because I flew over to KSW with Scott Askham. Scott Askham was main event against Khalidov in that event. So I actually saw that fight, and it was the first time that I was actually made aware of Andreas Gustafsson. I think Janikowski was like a massive favourite. Janikowski's like a KSW Polish hero. And Janikowski, by the way, for what it's worth, is an Olympic silver medalist in Greco-Roman wrestling. Greco-Roman being the key factor there. Obviously, that's more upper body wrestling than the freestyle wrestling of like a Henry Cejudo, Daniel Cormier type of thing. So with Andreas Gustafsson, he was taken down a couple of times, a few times actually, by Janikowski, but the fight was a close split decision. I thought the decision was correct, but it was still a close decision nonetheless, and that's against an elite wrestler, like an Olympic silver medalist. I mean, I know it's not freestyle wrestling, but Greco-Roman wrestling is still like, it was one of the original, you know, types of wrestling in the Olympics, so it's still a massive elite level wrestler that Gustafsson's been in there with and dealt with. And when I say dealt with, like I say, he didn't win, but, he wasn't getting taken down every time. He was getting back up to his feet too. Like, he handled himself inside the cage. So from that moment, I knew who Gustafsson was, and I kept my eye on him. Now, if you haven't watched the FCR fight with Andreas Gustafsson and Tony Lampinen, it's on UFC Fight Pass. I'm assuming 99.9% of people that are listening to this are going to have a UFC Fight Pass subscription. Go to UFC Fight Pass and watch that fight. That is one of the most entertaining, exciting, bloody wars. And when I say bloody, I'm not substituting that for the word fucking. I'm saying it was bloody. There was blood everywhere. It was an absolutely insane fight. I loved watching that fight. I'd never seen it before, and it was one of those fights where I start watching, I'd never seen it. I was like, holy shit, this fight is insane. Why have I never seen anybody talking about it? What a fight that was. Now, what that showed me is that Gustafsson, he can be got at, granted, but he's also tough as shit. The dude's durable, insanely difficult to get out of there, but also aggressive even when he's having a little bit of adversity that he can get over as well, which is important, knowing that when a fighter comes into the UFC. Then when you look at his Contender Series fight, which is obviously the fight that he got into the UFC, it was a very clinch-heavy fight. Like, he's very aggressive, he likes to use his physical attributes, pin his opponents against the cage. So when I saw that, I actually watched that fight before the Lampinen fight. So when I saw that fight, I thought, okay, this dude's got a ton of control. He'll probably good in the UFC, like physically strong, be able to pin and nullify opponents. Then when I saw the Lampinen fight, I was like, holy shit, he can be got at. But also, and now I know that he's gone through adversity, that he doesn't fold, that he doesn't quit, that he'll keep coming forward. And then he finished Lampinen with a face full of blood. So look, Andreas Gustafsson, I'm super excited for him in the UFC. Now, Parsons is a fighter that I've liked a lot as well over the couple of years that he's been in the UFC. He's a serviceable striker. He's got good wrestling, good grappling. Bet on him a few times, won some, lost some that I thought that he should have won where the judges didn't give him the decision. But Preston Parsons is a difficult fighter to face because he can embrace the grind himself. But I think he's in for a difficult fight here because when it comes to grind versus grind, Gustafsson, I think, is the better grinder and is also, again, I've said this a million times before and I'm going to say it again, predicting which fighter is going to be stronger, physically stronger, pre-fight is one of the hardest things to predict, to the point where it can, in some cases, be almost impossible to predict because fighters can be deceptively strong. But looking at Gustafsson, he is big, he's built big, and he just looks strong, like he's been strong against other guys that look strong. So I am going to make the educated assumption that he's going to be more physically strong than Preston Parsons. So again, coming back to the grind, if this is grind versus grind, I think Gustafsson's the better grinder who's going to be physically stronger and be able to move Parsons about. Now, if this is in the open space striking, I think Parsons is actually the better open space striker. It's just Gustafsson doesn't allow for too much open space striking unless he's getting good shots off himself. But if he's on the end of a load of punches that he's not returning to, he's going to close the distance and get a hold of Parsons. Now, where Parsons is best is within his wrestling and grappling. So we've now got to analyse that. So you can see it's a fight where there's a lot of different areas that are talking points. So with Parsons wrestling and grappling, look, I think he can score takedowns here. But the thing is, I've seen Gustafsson with my own eyes against a Damian Janikowski, a fight that a lot of people won't have seen because I don't think it is public anywhere. If it is, then please tell me where it is, and I'll add it to the tape index for MMA Play 365, so it's on there for everybody to see. Now, I've seen with my own eyes Gustafsson deal with an Olympic silver medalist wrestler, and he did okay. Like, Janikowski did end up winning the fight, but it was close. It was a split decision, and I just don't think that Parsons is going to have that level of wrestling that what Janikowski's got. So, again, I've seen Gustafsson deal with the wrestling side of things, even though he came up short. But in this fight, I don't think Parsons is as good of a wrestler as the other wrestler that I'm talking about in Janikowski. And I think if Gustafsson starts falling short on the strikes, he'll just get a hold of Parsons and just make it a grind. Just clinch, up against the cage, run the clock down, land some dirty boxing. And yeah, look, I like Gustafsson in this fight. I think that Parsons is going to have his moments. I actually think that Parsons may be somewhat relatively live at his current betting line. where he's around like a plus 160 underdog, but that line seems to be getting shorter, and the shorter it gets, I think the more value is going to come on Gustafsson. So for those reasons, I'm picking Andreas Gustafsson to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Ernesta Kareckaite versus the newcomer Nicolle Cagliari. Now, Nicolle Cagliari, it's an interesting one for sure, because I don't think Kareckaite is like a fighter that's going to really elevate herself in the UFC and get close to the rankings. I think she's a fighter that's going to be serviceable at a certain level, which I know is a phrase I've used a few times in this podcast, but, you know, it is relevant every time I've said it, in my opinion. But I think Kareckaite can be serviceable. She does have qualities, especially within her striking. She's very tall and long for the division. But it's more on, look, Kareckaite can be got at. She's a beatable opponent. She's not an opponent that's going to absolutely style on fighters at this level in the UFC. Although I do kind of think that she is a UFC caliber fighter. But with Nicolle Cagliari, with Cagliari, it was more of, right, okay, well, what has she got? Where can she get at Kareckaite? Now, the one issue Cagliari is going to have straight off the bat is the height difference. Like, Kareckaite is going to be much taller, much longer, much rangier. So Cagliari's got a job to do, first and foremost, in regards to closing the distance. But from what I've seen of Cagliari, she's got good trips and throws, and just like I said with Jose Johnson and Bunes earlier, like if Cagliari was more of a double leg girl, single leg, I think she's going to have difficulties taking Kareckaite down because of the length. But because she's got the trips and throws, she can get to a body lock fairly comfortably with the size difference. That's where being shorter does actually help you a little bit. And then that lower level of gravity, being able to trip her and roll with a throw, I think Cagliari can get takedowns in this fight. Now, Kareckaite doesn't have a bad grappling game, but that's the area where she can be got at. And I think Cagliari will be able to do good work on top of her. And then when it comes to the striking, like, I do think Kareckaite is potentially a level above from a technical perspective. But look, Cagliari is going to be well prepared. She trains with Marina Rodriguez, so that looks like a main training partner in Brazil. So Cagliari is going to have some good level of preparation when it comes to the striking. It's just, I think she's going to be able to close the distance and be able to take Kareckaite down. And then when you look at the betting line, Nicolle Cagliari is like a plus 200 underdog. And I think at the absolute worst case scenario for Cagliari is maybe she's on the end of a lot of punches. Maybe she doesn't get a takedowns going. Maybe she does lose a 29-28, or maybe she does lose a split decision. But at plus 200, that's a dice that is very tempting to roll. And I'll be honest, I'm sort of on the fence here because, you know, it is a newcomer in the UFC and there is some hesitancy and some pause with this type of fight. But man, like, I think it's going to be a close fight. I think worst case scenario, it's going to be a close fight that could go either way. And that type of fight, you always want to be on the underdog. So although I'm still at a pause from what I'm going to do from a betting perspective with this, from a pick and prediction, I'm absolutely siding with Cagliari. Like I say, I think that Kareckaite is going to have some advantages with the length and the striking, but Cagliari, if she can get inside and get body locks and get takedowns and be able to close the distance, and bear in mind, the more that she does that, the easier it's going to be, because Kareckaite will be slightly hesitant, and every time she comes forward, remember, we're in the small cage in Vegas, in the Apex as well, so every time Cagliari comes forward, with Kareckaite knowing that she's been taken down numerous times already, there's going to be some hesitancy and some pause in her own game from a distance management perspective. So I think it's one of these close fights. I'm not really confident of which way it's going to go, but like I say, from a betting perspective, when one side's like a plus 200 underdog, from a pick and prediction perspective, I'm siding there. So for those reasons, I'm picking Nicolle Cagliari to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Magomed Gadzhiesulov versus Bruno Lopez. So Gadzhiesulov, he had a bit of hype around him actually, and his fight against Brenson Ribeiro, like, Gadzhiesulov was a massive favourite in that fight, and that fight was made so much closer than what I thought it was going to be, what others thought it was going to be, what the betting market thought it was going to be. And with Gadzhiesulov in that fight, he scraped by with a majority decision win. The thing is, Brenson Ribeiro, I don't mean any disrespect, but he's not a fighter that's, you know, again, I don't, like I've just said with Kareckaite, he's not a fighter that I think is going to elevate himself in the UFC too highly. Like, I think his ceiling is okay where it is right now, but I just don't think it gets much higher. And Gadzhiesulov, what I'm going to do for Gadzhiesulov is I am going to give him a pass on that fight. It was his UFC debut, nerves, all that sort of stuff, UFC debut jitters, and all athletes can have a bad day. I know he trains at a great gym. I know that he's got really good training partners, and I know he's got good qualities about him. He can wrestle, he can grapple, he's a good kickboxer as well. I just know that there's a good fighter in there, and we didn't see that on his UFC debut. But how many times have we seen a fighter that have got good qualities about them come into the UFC debut and just fall flat and lose, and then go on like a 4-5 fight winning streak afterwards? Like, I'm not saying Gaziazulov's going to go on a 4 or 5 fight winning streak, but he's definitely, look, he didn't even lose that fight. That's the good thing for him. Like, he had an off night, in my opinion, and still won the fight just. Now, Bruno Lopez, he's no slouch. Like, on the other side, Bruno Lopez is a fighter that's aggressive, that's big, that's going to come forwards, that's going to try and land on Gaziasulov. It's just, I think Gaziasulov's going to move a little bit better than Bruno Lopez. I think he's going to be a little bit quicker, and I think he's more well-rounded as well. And with Gaziasulov, he's a good kickboxer to the point where he's got good striking, that he can either stay striking if that's what he wants to do, or use the striking to set up takedowns. So I think he's going to be good, whether it's striking, whether it's wrestling or grappling, whereas I think Bruno Lopez is probably going to have more success trying to strike and trying to hit Gaziasulov with something hard to hurt him and get respect early on. But if Gaziasulov is going to be the quicker striker, the more technical striker, and the better mover, I think that Bruno Lopez is going to have trouble from, just landing that hard shot, and even from closing the distance and getting a takedown on Gaziasulov. That's possible. But again, if the striking is slicker and the movement's quicker and there's a speed advantage, then Lopez is going to struggle there as well. So I kind of feel that although Gaziasulov almost fell flat in his last fight as a big favourite, he's still like around a -200 favourite in this fight. So it's not hit the betting markets too hard on Gaziasulov's line. And that's because, in my opinion, there is a good fighter still there. And I think we see a better version this time than what we saw last time. So for those reasons, I'm picking Magomed Gaziasulov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Victoria Dudakova versus Fatima Klein. Now, Fatima Klein is the biggest favourite on the card. She's like a -1,000 favourite. I don't think that favourites at -1,000 are very smart in this sport, but I also understand why that line's not lower, because you can argue for days that, look, no fighter should be -1,000 in MMA because anything can happen, and I agree. However, what's going to happen if Fatima Klein's a -300 favourite or a -400 favourite here? That number's going to get absolutely slammed to the point where the bookies don't have any option to keep pricing it higher. So that's what I mean when I understand it. Look, Fatima Klein, she had a tough UFC debut. She was up a weight class. She was against Jasmine Jasvidicius, who was clearly physically stronger, and that's where Klein struggled. Klein's a really good grappler, high-level grappler. She's got wrestling and takedowns to go with it. She's also got some Muay Thai to go with it as well. She's going to be a very dangerous fighter now she's back in her natural weight class. Now, when you look at Dudakova's strengths in MMA do seem to... No, she's a good striker, but they do seem to be within the wrestling and getting her opponents down and having some good top control time, landing some ground and pound, looking for a submission. But Dudakova is literally going to be entering the lion's den if she tries to take down Fatima Klein, or maybe even Klein accepts a takedown from her if she shoots in. But if Dudakova goes down to the mat with Klein, it's going to be like a sheep throwing the sheep to the wolves type of scenario, where I just think that Dudakova is just completely and utterly outmatched at a really high level, because that's where Klein is at. She's at a high level with the wrestling and grappling. So then that leaves the striking of Dudakova. And Dudakova's got serviceable striking, but again, for me, I think Klein's the better striker. So I think if this is a 15-minute kickboxing fight, I think Klein could put on a clinic, potentially even knock Dudakova out. If this isn't a 15-minute kickboxing fight and we see wrestling and grappling, then for me, it's all Klein as well. It's one of these fights where, again, you can never be too surprised with outcomes in MMA, but I would be very surprised if Dudakova wins this fight, just because looking at this fight from the outset, pre-fight, I just don't see how Dudakova wins this fight. Maybe she does catch Klein, we're back to the new old gloves. So maybe, a hard punch does catch Klein. Maybe she knocks her out, but it's just a very low percentage outcome in my opinion. So I think for Dudakova to beat Klein, if she's not knocking her out, I certainly think she's not submitting her. She's got to beat her over 3 rounds, and I just think that Klein's better in every aspect of MMA. So that's it for the breakdown, short and sweet. I'm picking Fatima Klein to win this fight. And finally, the last fight to break down. We've had 14 fights on this card, so it has been a little bit of a slog. We've got Nurullo Aliyev versus Yanal Ashmouz. Now, I'll be honest, I faded Nurullo Aliyev last time out when he fought Rafael Alves. The reason I faded him is because Alves has got like this really sick guillotine, it's his signature choke, and I thought, look, if Aliyev's shooting takedowns and he leaves his neck exposed, he can absolutely get submitted with one of these guillotines from Rafael Alves. And then I thought, look, if the fight stays standing, then Aliyev is, again, a decent striker, but he's more of a wrestler, and Alves packs heat and will throw, a variety of different types of attacks. And Alves was the underdog as well, but it was one of them where, look, I almost had it, but I almost had it because Aliyev bit Alves. Look, that probably should have been a disqualification as well, by the way. Like, we've seen another bite since then. So, I almost had Alves, but for the wrong reasons. Like, I didn't have him because he was almost a better fighter. I had him because, he probably should have, been disqualified, or if not disqualified, a couple of points taken off, and a couple of points would have probably turned it into a draw, maybe. So, look, I faded Aliyev just because of the type of opponent he was fighting. Now, with Yanal Ashmouz, I think that he's a less of a dangerous type of opponent than Alves, because Alves does wing bombs. And look, Ashmouz hits hard as well. Like, you can't take that from him. But Alves just had this finishing ability where you could probably not be surprised if he loses an entire fight and then suddenly finds a finish out of nowhere. Whereas I'm not seeing too much of that from Yanal Ashmouz. Like I say, he does have knockout power, and you can't rule a knockout out, especially with the new old UFC gloves. So, look, Ashmouz could land that punch, but Aliyev's tough, he's durable. I think once he starts getting his wrestling going here, he's going to be able to take Ashmouz down. He's going to make it difficult for him. And even striking, I think that as long as Aliyev stays out the way of, a hard punch from Ashmouz, anything that's loaded up, I think Aliyev will be able to just nicely strike at a pace that's dictated by himself, where he's dictating the range also, and then using the striking to setting up his takedowns. So I think it's going to be a difficult fight for Ashmouz to really activate his game plan and start pulling away, because if he doesn't knock Aliyev out, then like I've just said with Dudakova and Klein, if he doesn't knock Aliyev out, he's going to have to beat him in a 3-round decision, and that I just really don't see happening. Like, the level of wrestling and grappling that Aliyev's got, and the fact that he will go to it, and you can sort of be super confident in Aliyev going to that game plan because that's how he fights, and he fights to his strengths. I just don't think Ashmouz is going to be that competitive from a defensive perspective. So, for all the reasons that I've mentioned, I'm picking Nurullo Aliyev to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast, the first one for 2025. It's also going to be released early for you guys as well, so you're not having to wait till Monday. You've got a full, it depends where you are location-wise, but you've either got a full or half a Friday and a full weekend to tune in. So, yeah, thank you all for tuning in. As always, I always appreciate everybody listening. I also really appreciate people, dropping YouTube comments, as long as you're not an ass and being arrogant or, overly offensive or anything like that. I always give time to people that, give the right time to me, if that makes sense. So again, if you're listening to one of these podcasts on the podcast platforms like Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, then please head over to YouTube if you want a conversation, because we've got a comment section on there. Of course, you know what YouTube's about. Tell me who you're betting on. Tell me where we disagree. We can always have a conversation. I am usually extremely busy throughout the fight weeks in other roles within MMA, so I do sometimes struggle to get back to comments, but I always try my best. But it is me that will be replying to the comments when I get to it. So yeah, come on to YouTube. If you're on there, please drop a subscription to the YouTube channel as well. It's free. You'll also get notifications every time a YouTube video is released on the channel as well. And for one last time, if you are wanting to jump into the action this weekend from a betting perspective, then make sure you hit up MMAplay365.com. We've got something for every type of gambler. The subscriptions are super affordable. We don't separate the subscriptions with, different packages for like the AI or the handicapper advice. Everything's all in one package. You've just got to choose whether you want just one event monthly or whether you want to take advantage of our discounted annual subscription as well. And again, our ethos is keep the price as low as possible so you can start making money on the bets that you're placing. quicker rather than later. That's all at MMAplay365.com. I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next week.